Hey everyone, I just wanted to take a moment to tell you about today's sponsor, King Arthur Legends Rise. It's a turn-based RPG from Kabam, the same people that brought you Disney's Mirrorverse and Marvel's Conquest of Champions. This time, you'll be journeying through an Arthurian-themed world to collect different knights, weapons, upgrade those weapons, and fight daunting mythical monsters. The game's got the visuals, the intimidating enemies, and the quests to boot. As the title implies, it sees you in the shoes of a young King Arthur who's gathering a party of loyal knights to help him defeat the challenges within the now ruined Camelot. The gameplay is familiar to fans of turn-based RPGs, requiring strategic plays and compositions to secure a victory. However, what makes King Arthur Legends Rise unique is that it is available on both mobile and PC with cross-progression, meaning you can start one of 20 chapters on your computer, then pick up exactly where you left off on the road. It's not just combat, but it's also puzzles and an engaging story. This too is just the beginning, as more story chapters, game modes, and heroes will be coming out in post-launch updates. If you're interested in King Arthur Legends Rise, you can pre-register for the game by clicking the link in the description and pinned comment. And I hope you enjoy the game on release by again clicking the link in the description and pinned comment. And thank you to King Arthur Legends Rise for sponsoring this video. Space is a subject of fascination for many people. Anything could be out there. It's the next step for civilization, the great beyond, the final frontier. As far as science is concerned, the universe outside of Earth is silent. No life, no organisms, just nothing. And that's scary. Staring into space is like staring into the void. A vast emptiness that, while filled with stars, lacks so much density that they may as well be infinitely out of reach. Maybe it's comforting knowing that beyond our atmosphere is nothing, but fear is born out of what we don't know. And if there's one thing I can be certain of when it comes to the cosmos, it's that there's definitely something out there, and that is terrifying. Dead Space, an ironic title for a game where the greatest threat is life itself, released initially in 2008, was developed by Redwood Shores, published by EA, and stars Isaac Clarke. The year is 2058, and Earth is nearly uninhabitable. Isaac, on one of the many ships sent to mine other planets for resources, has to make a pit stop on one of their larger models due to a distress signal. Fine by him, he'll get to reunite with his girlfriend Nicole. Clarke is an engineer, not trained for combat, and his suit, pristine in its minimal copper glory, presumably hasn't seen bloodshed before. That changes remarkably fast. But we've been here before, haven't we? Dead Space was remade in 2023, and with it came some significant changes, such as Isaac having a voice, the backtracking being cut down, and said backtracking being more dynamic, and of course, there's been an intense graphical overhaul. I'll be looking at the remake purely because I believe it's the best way to experience the game, and hey, it's even free on PlayStation Plus. This game looks gorgeous, but not really. I mean, yeah, the lighting is nice, texture work is superb, but the place is a dump, and I appreciate what they were going for. No wall is without a cry for help haphazardly scrawled across it. No room without blood splattered across the floor, and there are many points where these decorations add to the fear. Enemies often come out of the vents in the early game, and said vents all look the same. They even have convenient yellow paint on them, assumedly so the staff of the Ishimura know that they're supposed to interact with it. But you might notice that these vents are everywhere, sometimes with accompanied blood, and sometimes with their cover completely torn off. This scares me. If it's untouched, the anticipation of an enemy forces me to push my stick as lightly as possible. If it's open, then I know a necromorph could be in here with me. And if there's blood, then I know a necromorph is likely taking solace in the maze of the vents, waiting to pounce on me when I least expect it. What furthered this paranoia is that just as often as there was an enemy in the vents, there wasn't. There would be many times where I would get to the end of a hallway and encounter no pushback, no jump scare, and that's undoubtedly important. Fear's greatest weakness is knowledge. The more I know about an experience, the more comfort I can take in it. If an enemy truly was around every corner, and it happened enough times for me to expect it, I'm no longer caught off guard, and while it may startle me, I'm not exactly scared because it's part of the script. Instilling fear needs to be done a lot, but I think horror is a genre where less is more, and I find Dead Space strikes a very difficult balance between keeping my adrenaline and heart rate high without showing all of its cards. Unfortunately, these tricks can only be kept up for so long, but by the time a seasoned player gets to their second playthrough, the necromorphs lose their fear factor, and that's unavoidable. What makes Dead Space stand out from the rest is that underneath the horror is a genuinely good game, which is not always the case for its contemporaries. Let's talk a bit more about the horror genre, and more specifically, my inexperience with it. I hate scary things. I'm a naturally paranoid, easily frightened person. I hate being scared, especially by loud noises or flashing images. But you know what I hate more than being scared? Being bored. Outlast, for as much as I was terrified in the first 2 hours, by the final 2, I was bored. The jump scares still got me to jump, but they didn't scare me. And when I wasn't jumping, I was manipulating the piss poor AI and not much else. Outlast doesn't give you a way to defend yourself, and at first that's terrifying, but eventually it comes at the sacrifice of the gameplay, as players are forced to embody a passive playstyle, even when their threat isn't very threatening. It made me realize that Outlast was all horror and hardly any game, which may be incredibly incredibly reductive, but the point I'm trying to make is that not only was I scared of Dead Space, but I was having fun too. Before we go any further, I want to define what I fear most, because fear is as subjective as music. Subnautica is a game all my friends were scared of when we played it, but I wasn't scared at all. I don't know why, but the ocean, even at its deepest, doesn't inherently scare me. Alternatively, games like Dying Light scare the living hell out of me, and yet comparatively, Dying Light is far lighter on horror. For me, fear comes from simply not wanting something to happen, mixed with my mind exaggerating a negative outcome. In games, I often fear death because it's a fail state, so even in games like Counter-Strike, when I'm against all odds, I'm terrified because I don't want that negative outcome of losing, letting down the team and failing to clutch. No! Now, do I fear deranking as much as aliens or demons? No. But when it comes to games, fear can take many forms, and can be used to manipulate the player in interesting ways. However, I think jump scares are incredibly cheap. Jump scares serve to startle me, but I don't feel any inherent fear. I don't panic, because most jump scares are over quickly. I'm not impressed that the game flashes a scary face to make my heart skip a beat. For these reasons, as is always the case when I cover potentially scary things on the channel, I will not refrain from showing scary imagery or tones, but any jump scares, if explicitly necessary to show, will be accompanied by a countdown, and their volumes will be lowered. To get back on track, when I got past the scare when the necromorph had revealed itself, I became incredibly excited because the gameplay is absolutely excellent. The gameplay is what makes Dead Space a good horror game, because it's a good game. Horror in many games manifests in music, tone, visual storytelling, something Dead Space does well. But what I find happens when you get to the gameplay of a horror game is that it becomes boring. I was never bored in Dead Space, because it takes typical third-person shooter mechanics and flips it on its limbs. On first glance, the necromorphs don't look very different from zombies, especially the first few you see stumble towards you like any other walker. But what the game does to ensure the players know that these are not zombies is take away the most important survival tip. Aim for the head. Aiming for the head in Dead Space, contrary to what you're conditioned to believe, is the most inefficient means of taking enemies down. And efficiency is important not just because you want to eliminate the threat fast, but because you want to conserve ammo. Every encounter uses finite resources, so if I can stretch each bullet, then I am better equipped for the next encounter. Instead, you want to shoot the monster's limbs, take their legs off so they can't move as quickly, take their arms off so they can't attack as well. And often, once enough limbs are removed, they'll go down, but are only truly finished off by Isaac's boot grinding them into ground beef. You know, satisfaction plays a significant role in how fun gameplay is. Often an enemy will drop ammo or an item, but if you stomp their corpse after, then they'll drop another item, so you'll be stomping a lot in this game. Fortunately, every grunt and the pure audible euphoria of steel boot mincing whatever is between it like a fucking battering ram doesn't get old no matter how much I do it. It's also satisfying to shoot the limbs off because it gives the player a sense of control. The game is still tough, but when you are so out of your depth, it's easy to power trip on a relatively minimal amount of control. Eventually, as you progress, you'll unlock the stasis pulse, which allows you to essentially freeze enemies and objects. Now I can freeze an enemy and pick them apart, exerting pure power over them. I think abilities like these, keeping in mind that they are very finite, allows players to feel a sense of comfort. Time is literally stopped. I can be slow, precise, breathe. Sometimes I don't freeze enemies for a power trip, but just to reposition, equip a different weapon, double check my surroundings. It's a moment to catch your breath, and pacing wise, that is extremely important. These abilities, your ammo, your healing items, everything is a finite resource that must be purchased with credits or found on the ship. And at least on normal difficulty, it's a slim supply. I found myself going through waves of surplus and fucking famine, dude. And those low moments were the worst, but also the best. When things are going good, I allow myself to miss. I panic fire more because I know I can afford it. When I have nothing, I pay more attention to my environment. So, spoiler alert, I lied about the abilities. There is one that can be used as much as you like, and that's the telekinesis. Through an upgrade on Isaac's suit, you can push and pull objects, and more importantly, sharp objects. If you find a javelin-shaped object, you can throw it so fast into the necromorphs that they will be pinned to the wall and immobilized. In the early game, it would be wise to kite the enemies towards a red barrel so you can take them out with just a single shot. But now, for free, you can bring the explosives to them. When ammo was low, I found myself paying far more attention to the environment because I could get a free kill, but it's often harder to set up those kinesis kills. When a necromorph appears, I have to weigh my options. Should I give in to my fear, shoot first, consult my supplies later, or take the measured approach and first scan the room to find extra tools? These tools, no matter what they were, provided something engaging and kept gameplay varied. You get a shocking number of weapons throughout this game, and early on, the moment you get comfortable with the way a tool works, a brand new one is found, creating an exciting cycle. Gun-wise, you'll have the plasma cutter, which by this point is iconic, even as someone who hadn't played the games previously. It has high damage output but low ammo and fire rate, meaning if you're confident you can make your shots count, it'll be old reliable, and for me, It was. Then we get the plasma rifle, which fires weaker bullets at a higher rate, perfect for panic situations where you're spraying just to slow an enemy down, or targeting harder to hit weak points. There's the Ripper that fires and holds a spinning buzzsaw, perfect for close quarters, high damage encounters, and the final weapon I used was the flamethrower. It doesn't do that much damage, but it's hard to miss with it, and it's great at crowd control as it has a high chance of staggering enemies. There are more weapons, but for the sake of brevity I want to stick to those 4. I found myself preferring these weapons because their alternate fire options were invaluable for allowing me to make sure I was always prepared. Instead of using 25 bullets from the plasma rifle, I could fire a grenade that does devastating damage for the same ammo cost. Instead of using the flamethrower, I could fire a wall of flames that halts enemies, acting as a last-ditch effort to slow enemies if I didn't have any stasis left. These alternate fire methods often use more ammo, so I couldn't use them all the time, but as I'm sure you've noticed, those split-second decisions to burn ammo for the sake of safety were what made the game tense and made the game fun, because making those decisions and living, sometimes dying with the consequences, reinforced the weight of those split-second calls. But there's another reason I found myself conveniently sticking with the first few weapons, and that's because they were always stronger than what I had. As you move through the game, you'll come across nodes. These can be purchased at the shop for a pretty penny, or can be found on the ship. Now, I want to be as prepared as possible for an encounter for a few reasons. 1, it minimizes fear. 2, it's rewarding to have more control over a situation. And 3, I don't know when I'll have another chance to upgrade my suit, my weapons, or anything else. Naturally, I used them while I had the chance, but this created an issue where every new gun was inferior to what I already had. And if I wanted to try a new weapon, I wasn't rewarded because I would notice immediately that while these weapons were interesting, I was happier with the other ones which hadn't lost their novelty and were significantly better at protecting me. Now granted, this could be me optimizing the fun out of the game, but to that I say, I was still loving the game. My argument here is that I would have experimented more if, along with those new weapons, I was given a few notes to upgrade them with, or better yet, have them already do more damage than the plasma cutter with a few upgrades. This would maintain the feeling of progression because if the player missed upgrade nodes, then this new weapon would be both useful and offer more variety. I think the game does a solid job of giving you little pushes to use these weapons, such as the abundance of ammo for that new weapon once it's acquired, but that push is contradicted by the pull of selling the ammo you aren't using, for credits that can buy ammo for the weapons you are using. In most areas, you'll have safe zones, lights are on, there's a store, a save station, some healing items, and they give players a moment to prepare to venture into the dark again, unsure of when they will return to comfort. What isn't there is an upgrade station. New weapons are found, never bought, and unfortunately for Isaac, the most interesting sites are where the danger is. This, pacing-wise, made Dead Space such a tight experience. Every side and main room I entered had something of value to offer. At times it was ammo when my guns were empty, and other times it was a haunting revelation about what the hell is going on here. Sometimes it was just a save station, making me dread whatever's around the corner, and other times it was a weapon bench placed curiously next to a vent that made me wonder if I get jumped the moment I decide to focus on something other than my surroundings. I never found myself unrewarded for my exploration, and that's important in a game like this where I, as a massive baby, would prefer to beeline it to my objective. But there's always one room I often chose not to enter, and that's the bathrooms. Bathrooms contain good items, but they also contain vents, grates, stalls, tight corners, and a myriad other ways for necromorphs to catch me off guard. For me, the biggest source of comfort in Dead Space was space itself. If I was in a tight hallway with an enemy at the end of it, then I was scared, scrambling, purely uncomfortable. But if I had an open area, if I had the room to move, time to react, and a means of surveying the situation, I was comfortable. Thankfully, Dead Space never ambushes you like a Souls game, but they certainly make you think it's possible, and the bathrooms were the epitome of that. The camera barely has room to see everything, and if an enemy were to show up, I'd have no room to move. It's this exact anticipation that scared the living hell out of me in this game, and that kind of fear, the kind that isn't achieved by cheaply startling me or forcing me to be defenseless, is something I can actually get behind. Conceptually, the story Dead Space tells is a scary one too, because what happens to these people on this ship, in the middle of space where no one can hear their screams, let alone their SOS signals, is a nightmare. The necromorphs were all once people. As the name implies, they morphed and distorted corpses. Said people began transforming into creatures driven by an alien structure known as the Marker. The scary part about the transformation is that it begins far before the victims are impaled by what they will soon turn into. Their proximity to the Marker slowly drove them mad. First it was paranoia, then it was audible hallucinations, then it was visual hallucinations, and it kept getting worse. These people eventually felt compelled to serve the Marker, to protect the necromorphs, to potentially take their own lives. They turned on their friends, became erratic, and they weren't savable. Some of these necromorphs transformed in other ways, and the thought of how they became what they are is equally as haunting. We know the necromorphs on the ship were at one point human, so when we see small necromorphs shooting projectiles out of what looks like umbilical cords, it brings to mind the horror of a child being torn inside out, born to serve the Marker. For some enemies, I don't know what the origin is. For the ones that move exclusively on their arms, who could they have been before? Sometimes I assume when a large amount of people are infected at once, they can, in a state of transformation, melt together, which would cause the Colossus we fight halfway through the game. Its tentacles the size of a hallway, its organs bigger than a vehicle. It's moments like this when the encounter is so outlandish that it leaves horror and enters pure action. And these moments were great. As mentioned, the gameplay is good enough that Dead Space can afford to ease up on the horror without the threat of boredom. And as these different boss fights show, they use those moments to the best they can. My only grievance was that the attacks of the Goliath were a bit too difficult to dodge. I couldn't get a clear idea of where its tendrils were shooting, often causing me to move into its trajectory when I hadn't intended for it. This could be my ineptitude with the zero gravity controls, which this fight does take place within. At times you'll use your suit's jets to traverse zero-G environments, and these as a novelty were great, but the controls aren't as intuitive as I would have liked, leading to many moments where I became lost, unsure of where solid ground was, and unsure of my trajectory, which became especially apparent in the combat. This could certainly be a skill issue, and since the game never throws too much at you, maybe the intention was to have these zero-G moments be scary because you were ill-equipped. But for me, it put a minor damper on the first big boss fight, and the first big action hero victory Isaac has over the Necromorph invasion. This fight was actually the most difficult by far, as the Leviathan and eventually Hive Mind is significantly easier, and not to the game's benefit. The Leviathan has an interesting concept, having to use turrets, and I found especially the third phase to be a nice challenge. It throws a lot at you, tendril strikes, mines, and projectiles, but the zero-G setting means you have enough time to react to those attacks and find gaps of your own. The final fight is conceptually strong, and as a climactic final push against the Necromorphs, I loved it, but I think it's too long and too easy. The Hive Mind's attacks are easily dodged, heavily telegraphed, and the combos it throws out are so long that I found myself bored mid-fight. I think difficulty-wise, the game was doing a stellar job of upping the ante, especially when it came to introducing new enemy types, but this felt a little anticlimactic, especially when the gauntlet up to that point was, to me, tough as nails. But even that too has some repetition problems. You'll notice that the first half of Dead Space isn't very hard at all. The game doesn't overwhelm you with enemies and certainly doesn't expect perfect aim, which is good because under pressure, I sure as shit am missing most of my shots. The entertainment at this point in the game comes from a few things: fragility and a lack of knowledge. We're scared because we don't know what is around each corner. You'll see in much of my early footage that I'm very slowly walking through the halls because I want to make sure I observe everything and don't get caught off guard. By the middle points, you'll have seen most of the enemy types, you'll know how the game scares you, and most importantly, you'll know best how to fight back. This is a change in the player's capability and comfort with the situation, but it applies to Isaac too. Where he once relied on an engineering tool and a basic uniform, he now uses grenades and flamethrowers and a chunky suit of armor. By the end of the game, it almost becomes a power fantasy with how easily you can mow down the hordes, and it's good that once the game does lose its fear factor, which isn't a criticism, it's unavoidable, the game falls back on its excellent gameplay, and the story begins ramping up. I think the biggest issue with the gameplay loop for me was that things are never simple. Most chapters start the same way. Hey Isaac, go do this thing. Should be simple. Then you get there, and the simple thing now has a complicated prerequisite, meaning you get sidetracked before finally doing what you set out to do. But now there's another roadblock, and so on. Narratively, it makes sense. The people of the Ishimura were sabotaging the ship in any way they could, but as far as the gameplay loop goes, it was a bit tiring. I also think that not all enemies get the same amount of love. The Necromorphs on board the USM Valor have stasis packs on their chests that, if shot, will slow them down, which rewards skill and gives us yet another way of dealing critical damage while avoiding the head. Then we have the lurker enemies that are childlike, crawling on the walls, distanced from the player, and attacking with 3 tendrils that shoot projectiles. These enemies suck. I don't mind the idea on paper, but in motion, they're a constant annoyance as they can poke from afar while you're unaware of their location, or while you are preoccupied. I can appreciate that as a horror game, Dead Space wants you to be in a place with low visibility, but to then have relatively small enemies that can poke from afar makes me feel more annoyed at them than scared. If their tendrils had a stronger glow, the issue might be mitigated, but it's hard to say. Aside from those minor gripes, Dead Space is a damn good horror game and a great shooter underneath that. I was constantly entertained by the shooting, immersed in the world, and intrigued by the story and its many twists. I'll admit that the story is a bit confusing, but in a good way, because as the story progresses, we realize that we can't exactly trust what we see. The game opens with a small crew heading to the Ishimura, where Isaac is excited to see his girlfriend Nicole. Things have already gone to hell when they arrive, but as Isaac figures out what's going on and tries to get help, complications come up. He's first split from his team. Hammond and Daniels are left to deal with their fallen comrades' bodies, while Isaac is tasked with finding a way back to them. fighting through necromorphs along the way. The necromorphs seem to be tied to an alien artifact called the Marker, and certain fanatic unitologists believe that it is essentially the next step in evolution. It becomes clear as the story goes on that getting back up isn't an option, as even the Valor, a ship sent to aid the Ishimura, is miraculously invaded by the necromorphs after one of them left the Ishimura in an escape pod. We run into Nicole a few times where she's surprisingly calm about the whole situation and begging for Isaac to make them whole again. Moving through the Ishimura in the beginning hours makes it seem as though this is a freak accident. We read diaries of how those close to the Marker experience hallucinations and severe personality changes. It results in seeing some scrawlings on the wall, some mangled bodies, but not much else. That was until I came across a room with symbols on the floor and an image of the Marker. It was the first oh shit moment I had. I had read about what the Marker does to people for the last 2 hours, but to see a manifestation of it in front of me gave me chills. Fortunately, this is the worst it gets for a while until you enter the endgame, where the Marker's hallucinations causes people to build intricate models of the Markers, shrines that trade decorative candles for decorative corpses. It shifts the threat from the monsters on board to the Marker, shifting the horror from being that of alien humanoid life forms to a more Lovecraftian virus, causing those afflicted to go insane or take their own lives. What makes matters worse is that Isaac, having been in close proximity to the Marker for so long now, is having his own hallucinations, manifesting in the screen blurring and pulsing. Discovering how the Ishimura fell, what the Valor was really here for, and how the Marker works is what most of the story here is. Many of the primary objectives are simply going somewhere and fixing something, but along the way you learn more about the necromorphs, and that story was a damn compelling one. We talked to Daniels and Hammond about the outbreak, why they were sent to the ship, and what the government's larger role in this is. Eventually, distrust begins brewing between the crew, as it seems Hammond might know more than he's letting on. These trust issues are put to rest when Hammond eventually dies, and Isaac's hunt for Nicole culminates in finally meeting Nicole face to face, and being told from a unitologist that in order to stop the infection, we need to return the red marker to the planet Aegis 7. These final moments become even more uncomfortable, despite the general lack of necromorphs roaming the halls. This is because the visual oddities become more clear, and the game hints at certain twists coming around the corner. I mean, what the fuck does make us whole again even mean? And how come the Ishimura sign says us is you? Could that have something to do with making two people whole? The convergence of two or more beings? Probably not. What matters now is getting the Marker back to Aegis 7. As we load it onto the last functioning ship on the Ishimura, Daniel shoots our unitologist in the back, explaining that she needs to take the Marker and toss it into space, lest someone else find it. Isaac recalls the ship and commandeers it with Nicole, taking both it and the Marker to Aegis 7, where he encounters Daniels once more. Daniels reveals that Nicole was actually a unitologist from earlier that, due to the Marker's influence, we have been seeing as Nicole this whole time. She was dead before you arrived. This is a twist I don't want to get into because it's been done to death on YouTube. Hey guys, welcome back to Totally Obscure Facts About Games. Did you know that the first letter of each chapter spells Nicole is dead? Yeah, we fucking get it, dude. Real original. I think it's well executed, and despite me knowing the twist before playing, I found joy in seeing how it was foreshadowed. And the atmosphere of the game carried the scenes when the mystery simply couldn't. Once the hive mind is destroyed, we leave, but not before Nicole gives us one final jump scare that warranted a new pair of boxers. I actually think my biggest conflicting opinion is on the ending. On one hand, I think it was grandiose, cinematic, sort of fun, but I also wanted to see what happens to Isaac after this. All of this turmoil, horror, and our reward is just that Isaac is in space, not dead, and that he's still suffering from the effects of the Marker? I know the sequels delve into what happens next, so fair enough, but when looking at the first game in a vacuum, more would have been nice, though I don't know if that's even possible. Isaac's parents are gone, Nicole's gone. Who does he go home to? Will the government want him dead, likely knowing what he's done? Can he go back to normal after what he's seen? The visions of Nicole make it unlikely. Once the game is completed, you unlock New Game Plus and a brand new suit of armor that looks absolutely immaculate. I think a second playthrough of the game is a lot of fun because it flips the early gameplay on its head, as you'll now be easily gunning down the necromorphs, looking cool while doing it, and noticing the subtle foreshadowing that makes the second playthrough narratively more fun. What's further appreciated is that because most of the exposition takes place over the radio, I didn't often have to stop what I was doing. I used this playthrough to complete side quests I missed on my first run, and I think they were quite good. Rewards were either treasure or explanations for what happened to the crew members, and when the lore and story for this game is so interesting, I found that to be a worthy motivation. Once finishing my playthrough, I realized that Dead Space is the best horror game I've ever played. That may be a bold statement, but it's for a lot of reasons. The first is the scares and atmosphere. Dead Space doesn't simply get in your face and startle you. Sure, you'll be startled plenty, but often my greatest fear came from what might be around the corner, and facing that fear was a constant progression. At first, I rounded corners slowly, hoping that if there was something I could be prepared to run the other way. By the end, I charged around corners, gun raised, ready to take on whatever threat was on the other side. Said threats made for interesting gameplay too. When resources are limited, encounters have real stakes, as they could result in death if I miss my shots. Dead Space strikes a remarkable balance between offering enough resources to make sure the player always has what's needed to get through an encounter, but not so much as to enable any comfort. Jump scares were here, but they were never loud enough to feel annoying. Just enough to get the heart pumping. But what matters most to me was that under that horror was gameplay that was so tight and fun that other horror games I've played were unable to provide. Personally, I hate being defenseless, helpless, passive. So the fact that I can have fear and be proactive made this game amazing. I know Dead Space already has a solid reputation online, and I'm happy to say that I get it. Will I end up playing the second one? Hard to say. The truth is, I'm still a little bitch. As much as I love this game, I was also feeling fear, a negative emotion for a majority of the playthrough. My critical brain can look past that to see this game's strengths, but my emotional side struggles to get past it. If this video does well, then I'll probably cover the second game, but even then, I wouldn't hold out hope. As it remains, Dead Space is the greatest horror game I've ever played. But, full transparency, the only other horror game I've played is Outlast. Okay, happy Halloween, bye!